I wasn't looking for a conspiracy when I started researching this. I was trying to understand a gap. A 41-year gap, to be precise. London opened an underground railway in 1863. New York City, the most powerful, most congested, most financially dominant city in the Western Hemisphere, didn't open one until 1904. That's not a delay. That's not bureaucratic slowness. That's something else entirely. And when I started pulling on that thread, what came out wasn't inefficiency. It was a story that someone spent 150 years making sure you'd never hear. Because here's what they don't put in the history books. New York already had a subway. It opened in 1870. It carried 400,000 passengers in its first year. It worked, and then it vanished. Not declined, not got replaced by something better. Vanished. The tunnel was bricked up. The station was sealed. The car sat underground untouched in the dark for 42 years. When construction workers accidentally broke through a wall in 1912 and found it, the air was still warm. The car was still on its tracks. There was still a grand piano in the waiting room. 42 years, waiting for passengers who were never allowed to come back. That's not a story about engineering failure. That's not a story about a technology that didn't work. That's a story about what happens when the right people decide that something that works isn't allowed to keep working. And once you understand how it happened, you'll start seeing the same pattern everywhere, because it didn't stop in 1870. It never stopped. The man who built it was named Alfred Ely Beach. If you've never heard of him, that's not an accident. That's the point. Beach was the owner and editor of Scientific American, one of the most respected publications in the country. He was a patent lawyer who had processed thousands of inventions. He held patents himself, including a typewriter for the blind that won a gold medal at the 1853 Crystal Palace Exposition. This wasn't some eccentric dreamer working out of a garage. This was one of the most credentialed, most connected, most respected inventors in America. The kind of man whose proposals got taken seriously. The kind of man the establishment couldn't dismiss. So instead, the establishment did something more efficient. It ignored him until it could destroy him. Beach had been thinking about underground transit since 1849, when he first proposed a subway system in the pages of his own magazine. By the late 1860s, the need was undeniable. New York was drowning. 700,000 people were packed into lower Manhattan. The streets were medieval. Horse-drawn omnibuses moved at walking pace through traffic so dense that crossing Broadway could take 30 minutes. Horses collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell. The air was thick with manure and dust and noise. One newspaper reported that a healthy person couldn't ride a dozen blocks without developing a headache. Beach looked out from his office window overlooking City Hall and saw a city suffocating under the weight of its own success. And he had the solution. A tube, a car, a revolving fan, he wrote. Little more is required. In 1867, he built a working prototype at the American Institute Fair. A 100-foot wooden tube, 6 feet in diameter, carrying a car that seated 10 passengers. A giant fan at one end pushed the car forward, reversed the fan, and suction pulled it back. No smoke, no steam, no horses, just air. The public stood in line for hours to experience it. This was the future. Everyone who saw it knew it immediately. Clean, quiet, fast, modern, a city beneath the city. But Beach understood something important, something that changes the entire shape of this story. The people who controlled New York's transportation infrastructure had no interest whatsoever in a better system. They had interest in profit from the existing one. New York in 1868 was not governed, it was owned. William McGeer Tweed, known everywhere as Boss Tweed, ran the city like a personal revenue stream. His organization, Tammany Hall, was siphoning somewhere between $40 and $200 million from city contracts through kickbacks, inflated invoices, and straightforward theft. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend even today. But what matters for this story isn't the theft itself. It's what Tweed had invested in. Tweed had financial stakes in the elevated railway companies being planned for Manhattan. He had connections to the horse car lines that dominated surface transit. An underground subway wasn't just competition. It was an existential threat to every single revenue stream Tweed controlled. So when Beach approached the city for permission to build, yet he already knew what the answer would be. And so he did something that tells you everything about the system he was operating inside. He lied. Beach applied for a permit to build small pneumatic mail tubes under Broadway. Little pipes for sending letters and packages, completely innocuous. The city approved it without a second thought. Then Beach built something else entirely. He rented the basement of Devlin's clothing store at the corner of Broadway and Warren Street, or directly across from City Hall, directly under the windows of the men who would have stopped him if they'd known. And for 58 nights, his workers dug by lantern light, in total secrecy, carting the excavated dirt out before dawn, covering every trace before the city woke up. Think about what that means for a moment. One of the most respected men in America, a man with every credential, every connection, every legitimate reason to build. Arch was forced to operate like a criminal in the dark beneath the streets of his own city. Not because his idea was dangerous, not because his technology was unproven, but because the people profiting from the broken system couldn't afford to let the better one exist. He invented a hydraulic tunneling shield for the project, the first circular tunnel design ever used in America, and used it to carve 312 feet of tunnel, 9 feet in diameter, lined with brick, through the bedrock beneath Broadway. He spent $350,000 of his own money, $8 million in today's terms, every cent of his own. And what he built at the end of that tunnel was not what anyone expected. On February 26, 1870, Beach threw open the doors without warning. He invited journalists, politicians, and prominent citizens to come and see what he'd constructed beneath their feet. The newspapers couldn't find words adequate for what they saw. The waiting room had frescoed walls and elegant paintings. A grand piano stood in the corner. A bubbling fountain with goldfish sat at the center of the room, lit by gas lamps and special zircon lights that cast everything in a warm white glow. Plush settees lined the walls for waiting passengers. And then there was the car itself, cylindrical, upholstered, elegant, with seating for 22 passengers. The power came from what they called the Western Tornado, a 48-ton blower built by the Roots Patent Force Blast Company, all driven by a 100-horsepower steam engine delivering 100,000 cubic feet of air per minute. The car didn't jolt. It didn't shake. It glided. Passengers described the sensation as floating. No smoke, no noise, no vibration, just the soft rush of air and the impossible sensation of moving through the earth in comfort. 11,000 rides sold in the first 2 weeks, 400,000 in the first year. Scientific American declared that street dust, congestion, and the misery of surface transit would become relics of the past. The public didn't just approve, they demanded, build it across the whole city, extend it uptown. This is what we've been waiting for. Give us more. But Beach couldn't legally charge fares or expand without a proper franchise from the state. Everything he'd built was technically a demonstration. The proceeds went to charity, to an orphanage for children of soldiers and sailors. To get a real franchise, he needed Albany. And in Albany, Boss Tweed was waiting. For 4 consecutive years, Beach lobbied the state legislature, 1870, 1871, 1872, 1873. Bills passed both houses in 1871 and 1872. Governor John Hoffman vetoed them both. Hoffman was Tweed's protege, installed by Tammany Hall, answerable to Tammany Hall, and functioning as Tammany Hall's veto pen. The official objection was that the bills gave away too much public authority without adequate compensation. The real objection sat in Tweed's investment portfolio. Meanwhile, wealthy property owners along Broadway, men like John Jacob Astor and Alexander Stewart, filed lawsuits claiming tunneling would damage their building foundations. The litigation dragged on. The bills died. Beach kept coming back, and the system kept killing it. Every single time. The pattern is not subtle once you see it. A working technology, a public that wants it, an establishment that blocks it, not once, not twice. 4 consecutive years of coordinated obstruction. Then, in 1871, the walls closed in on Tweed. The New York Times obtained and published secret ledgers detailing the full scale of his theft. Thomas Nast's devastating cartoons in Harper's Weekly turned public opinion against him with a ferocity that powerful men rarely survive. Tweed was arrested, tried, convicted. He escaped to Spain, was extradited back, and died in a jail cell. With Tweed gone, the machine was broken. Beach finally had his opening. In 1873, the new governor, John Dix, signed Beach's expansion bill into law. Full authorization. 5 miles of pneumatic subway from Battery Park to Central Park. The entire spine of Manhattan running clean and silent beneath the streets. 4 years of fighting, and Beach had won. He had beaten the machine. He had beaten the corruption. He had beaten every veto, every lawsuit, every obstacle the system could construct. He had won. And then, 3 weeks later, it was over. On September 18th, 1873, J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy. Cook had been the primary financier of railroad construction across America. His bank's failure triggered a financial panic that spread through the economy like a fire through dry grass. 89 railroads went bankrupt. 18,000 businesses failed. Unemployment eventually hit 14%. The investors who had pledged to fund Beach's subway expansion didn't lose interest. They lost everything. They were gone overnight. Ask yourself about the timing. A working subway, a beloved public system, finally authorized after 4 years of obstruction by a corrupt political machine that had just been destroyed. And then, 3 weeks after the authorization was signed, the financial system collapsed, triggered by speculation in railroads. The exact industry that had blocked Beach's subway in the first place, the exact industry whose profits his subway would have threatened. 3 weeks. That's all the gap there was between victory and ruin. Beach had 6 months under his charter to secure funding. In the middle of the worst economic depression in American history, it was impossible. The Pneumatic subway closed. The demonstration ended. The Western tornado went silent. The fountain stopped. The piano sat unplayed. And the tunnel was bricked up, sealed, and forgotten. Beach spent the rest of his life watching the city he had tried to save choke on the same traffic he had already solved. He died in 1896. His obituary in the New York Times ran a few inches. The man who built America's first subway. The man who invented the tunneling technology still in use today. The man who proved underground transit was possible 3 decades before the city pretended to invent it. A few inches. 2 years after Beach died, the building above his station burned to the ground. Whatever remained of the waiting room, the fountain, the frescoes, was consumed. The tunnel sat sealed beneath Broadway. No marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement that it had ever existed. Then, in February 1912, workers digging the new BMT Broadway line broke through a brick wall and found themselves standing in a room that time had forgotten. The air was dry and warm. The car was still on its tracks. The piano was still in the corner. 42 years in the dark. Perfectly preserved. As if it were simply waiting, they photographed it. They documented it. They donated the tunneling shield to Cornell University. And then they destroyed everything else to make room for the new line. Cornell has since lost track of the shield, one of the most significant engineering artifacts in American transit history. Lost. The company that had inherited Beach's rights sued the city for destroying their property. The outcome of that lawsuit is unrecorded. Vanished. Wolfhass, like everything else connected to this story. In 2013, Elon Musk stood in front of cameras and announced something called Hyperloop. Pods traveling through low-pressure tubes propelled by air, moving passengers at extraordinary speeds between cities. The media declared it revolutionary, a fifth mode of transportation, something never before imagined, a tube, a car, a revolving fan. Little more is required. Alfred Beach wrote that in 1870. He didn't write it as a vision of the future. He wrote it as a description of something he had already built, something 400,000 people had already ridden, something that already worked. We are being sold the same technology, repackaged as innovation, 155 years after one man spent $8 million of his own money to prove it was real. And we're still waiting for it. Not because the technology doesn't work. The technology has always worked. We're waiting because the question was never whether it works. The question has always been who profits from the existing system and whether they'll allow a better one to exist. The 6 train runs beneath Lexington Avenue today. The N and R trains run beneath Broadway, through tunnels that incorporated what remained of Beach's original work. Every morning, millions of people descend into the ground and travel through a system that took 34 years longer than it should have to exist, because one man built the proof in secret at his own expense in 58 nights. And the people who owned the broken system decided that working wasn't enough. Somewhere in those walls, built into the infrastructure of the subway you ride today, are the bones of the first one. No plaque anyone can find, no memorial at the site where American Underground Transit was born. Just the tunnels and the trains and the 155-year-old question that nobody in power has ever wanted to answer. What else worked? What else was buried? What else are we still waiting for that someone already built and someone else decided we weren't allowed to have? The tunnel is gone. The car is gone. The piano is gone. Beach is gone. But the pattern that killed his subway isn't gone. It's still running. It's still running the same play, and the only thing that's ever stopped it is the same thing that eventually stopped Tweed. Enough people finding out. Which is exactly why you've never been told this story before, until now.